Hi, I did a video on the ontological argument and got all this criticism, and then Anselm's discussion about it back and forth. Um, Now, basically, what the ontological argument is, it is a priori, it's a attempt at a priori proof for the existence of God. Now, I mean, this is basically one that is not done through empirical observation, and it's done by reason, basically. But that's what it's being gone off of. And basically what it is Anselm states that God is a absolutely necessary being, a being to which no greater thing can be conceived. You have this standard where the absolutely greatest thing that you can conceive in your mind, that is, and that it's so, this whole perfect being that you're conceiving in your mind, you cannot conceive anything greater than that. That's basically where we're going right now. But then what he aims to say is that if we have this in our mind, if we have this great, wonderful being in our mind that we can conceive of in our mind, and we can't conceive of anything greater, then what that means is that he's inferring that it must therefore exist in true reality. Then we're talking about the fact that that if we have this in our mind, then it must exist in reality. Now, this is a big thing that lots of philosophers have discussed in metaphysics and religion and things like that, where about this absolutely necessary being. But I guess what I'm going to discuss here is Kant's critique. He has a critique in he has a critique of his of the argument in this book. But there's a selection of it. There's a excerpt of it in this book. But I mean, he's basically critiquing the ontological argument on the basis that he's talking about how it's impossible to have a ontological proof for God's existence. Now, what he does here is what he does throughout this. What he does throughout his little critique here that I find notable is he talks about a triangle with three angles. He's talking about three different angles. Now he's referring to God because I guess Anselm talks about God, in a way that he's absolutely certain of that God actually exists. He talks about it in that way, and that he's omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. So this is in all of the arguments. This is the greatest argument. I mean, this is the argument that looks at God in the greatest fashion. It looks at him in the greatest, most perfect way. So basically, Anselm makes the inference that if we have this conception of this great being in our mind, this absolutely necessary being in our mind, that it must be absolutely necessary in reality too. Now, Kant argues against this using the three angle and being the triangle thing. That if a triangle exists, it must have three angles, and then about three angles existing does not make it necessary that the triangle exists. Yeah, I mean that's one way to argue it. And then he also says that if X exists, it is not necessary that because X exists in the mind, it exists in the reality. Now, this is in this book, in his masterpiece critique. What he's doing is, he starts in preface A and preface B. He talks about how he's totally against the metaphysics prior to himself. He's talking about Descartes, Leibniz, and Malebranche, and people like that, who they talk about the soul, the body, and the world. They speculate about this. Like, for instance, Leibniz talks about mind, material as monads, and they talk about all these things in certain ways, and they don't have empirical justification for believing in those certain things. So it's a metaphysics that he goes against, which he goes against this whole book. The whole book is to go against this kind of thing, to go against the whole kind of thing that that you are looking at certain things with no justification for saying what you're saying. And just like he says here, I'm just going to read the first part of this critique. It is evident from what has been said that the conception of an absolutely necessary being is a mere idea, the objective reality of which is far from being established by the mere fact that it is in need of reason. On the contrary, this idea serves merely to indicate a certain unattainable perfection, and rather limits of the operations than, by the presentation of new objects, extends this sphere of the understanding. But a strange anomaly meets us at the very threshold, for the inference from a given existence in general to an absolutely necessary existence seems to be correct and unavoidable, while the conditions for the understanding refuse to aid us in forming any conception of such a being. Philosophers have always talked of an absolutely necessary being, and have nevertheless declined to take the trouble of conceiving whether and how a being of this nature is even conscionable, not to mention that its existence is actually demonstrable. So in this critique, he's basically attacking Leibniz and Descartes. Those are the people he's talking about, because Descartes has his version of the ontological argument, and they have their ideas of God and stuff like that. So he's not only is he critiquing Leibniz and Descartes, but he's also critiquing those who uphold this ontological argument and argue that it in some way or another proves God's existence. So that's. You can see, I like his language, because he's going against, he's going against this certain metaphysics which say things when they don't have reasons for saying them. Now, Kant is a transcendental idealist. Now he believes that lots of things are not empirically verifiable, and that's what he talks about in this book, in this masterpiece book. I mean, I've studied it, and I have quite a few videos on the various arguments. I mean, I might have maybe 5 or 6 videos on the various arguments in that book of his. But mostly, basically, what the big problem with the ontological argument is is existence a predicate? And a predicate, by predicate I mean like in a sentence you have a subject and you have a predicate. Let's say John is anxious. That there's a subject and a predicate in that sentence. John is the subject. Anxious is the predicate, because when I say John is anxious, not only are we affirming that a subject exists, we are affirming that a subject exists by saying the word John, but then also the predicate or property or quality is being we're saying something about this existence. We're saying that we are affirming the property of anxiety in John, but then. Basically, what's going on in the ontological argument is we're talking about God, and what Anselm does is he's using existence and being as a predicate, and we're saying he's saying that God exists, via his saying God is something than which nothing greater can be conceived, and he's saying that, and also what he's saying is that the belief in God and the belief in God is a analytic proposition. Now, also Kant in his masterpiece, he talks about judgments analytic and judgments synthetic. Judgments analytic are judgments which are true in virtue of the semantics of the language, and that through the predicate you are verifying what's going on there. Just because there's a certain relationship based upon language between the subject and the predicate, which makes the whole proposition true in virtue of that predicate. But then there's synthetic ones also. Synthetic ones makes the proposition not true. There's no truth just because of the predicate of the sentence. But Anselm is basically affirming that the proposition for God's existence is analytic, because he's saying that it's nothing new that has been observed, and that there's no need to view it as synthetic, which is untrue actually, because there's the conception in your mind, and you have all that stuff, which is definitely a priori, but none of that justifies God's existence. And then, so basically, Kant in his critique is arguing that existence is not a predicate. So but I mean, if existence was a predicate, then we would have, then the ontological argument would be a better argument. We would actually have something with it, and there would be more people doing stuff with it. And then basically what he really discusses at the end of his little critique is that God is something that transcends experience. He says that the things that the big metaphysicians before him talk about, like God, the soul, and the world, the true being of these things, he says, these things in themselves transcend experience, and then we cannot affirm anything based upon our experience, and that we have to look at those things based upon how they transcend experience, and that the ontological argument, because of the existence as a predicate thing, and plus the absolutely necessary being, which is not verified, as well, because just because what's in the mind doesn't mean that that's in reality. Because of all that stuff, he argues that the ontological argument is not a good argument for God. And actually, later in his critique of practical reason, he actually gives a reason to believe in God, which is that's a totally different thing, and I have a video on that, I believe. But he has totally, in his critique of practical reason, he has a totally different idea about God. He actually says something more about it other than it is something that transcends experience. So yeah, if there are people who have read Anselm or Descartes or anybody else who has read anything about the ontological argument, if there are anybody that thinks that the ontological argument is something that can be presented as an argument for God's existence, or if it needs reformation, we need to reform it. Is there anybody that thinks that there's any way of reforming this into something that could help prove God, or if the idea of an a priori proof is just screwed, as Kant thinks it is? So, thank you.